Wherever you are, welcome to this part 1 of a 5-part series. Let me start this series with the words that I intend to use to finish the series. China is not your enemy. The people telling you China is your enemy are the real threat. Having said that, there is so much against me that this is going to take a whole lot to prove. But that's what this series is about. I'm going to prove that China is not your enemy. And then you can make a judgment on why you're being told it is and what's happened as a result of you being told this. Western media, let's call it the Anglosphere media, although many in Europe hold the same opinion, it's generally negative on China. And this is because their country's foreign policies have been hijacked to suit US interests, more than they suit the interests of their own people. One of the interests that US pursues is that of a strategic threat. 70 years ago, it was Korea that formed the threat. 60 years ago, it was Vietnam. 50 years ago, it was Soviet Russia. And all of these were threats because they were communist. Then 30 years ago, it was capitalist Japan. A few years ago, it was clear that the European Union and the Euro were also a threat to US hegemony and power. But the conflict in Ukraine, leading to the destruction of Nord Stream 2 and sanctions on Russia, has eliminated Europe as a rising threat to America. Much of Europe is now either in recession or experiencing economic stagnation. Militarily, Iran, like Afghanistan and Iraq, two countries which did absolutely nothing to antagonize the USA except exist and perhaps be Muslim countries, is now a threat. Whilst politically, socially and economically, China is the one they're most worried about. And this has been going on for so long now that it follows a predictable path. We can watch as Western media, citing anonymous sources, will link Iran to minor skirmishes in Yemen and the Red Sea, and then, still using anonymous sources, attempt to link support for Iran from China. This is a well-worn path, and it's already started, with USA bringing a coalition of countries into the defense of shipping in the Red Sea, and therefore escalating the conflict in a few square miles of Gaza to a much wider sphere. Assuming the world continues to traverse the current path and a world war is avoided, USA's strategy will be to attempt to force China's growth down and backwards. We can see it already economically. It started with cotton and tomatoes, then solar panels, then mobile communications after that, semiconductors and EV vehicles, and ridiculously now even garlic. They're doing the same as they did with the Soviet Union and Japan. In the unlikely event that it was to happen and they succeed in reversing China's growth, their current friend, India, will rise until it too becomes a threat to them, and it becomes their next national security threat. Why do they need these threats? It's because, as President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned, the creation of a permanent arms industry out of the remnants of a manufacturing requirement during the war years. As he said, the potential of a disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Exist it certainly does, and the potential of it persisting has become a reality. The voracious beast needs continuous feeding, and war is what it feeds on. Gareth Evans, a former deputy leader of Australia's Labour Party, wrote in the Australian public policy journal Pearls and Irritations of a threat from China. But he wrote that Australia can't rely on the USA to save it from that threat. I disagree that there's a threat from China. The only reason China is a threat to Australia or any other country, including the USA, is because the USA says so. Many people, even those who think their global positions on China should be handled diplomatically and are optimistic, believe that China is a threat. And that's understandable. In fact, in the Anglosphere, it's very hard not to be of that opinion. As Evans points out, at least in Australia, the threat is widely held in think tanks, the Department of Defense, and media which assertively amplifies these threats. The current Defense Minister, Richard Marles, holds the opinion that China is a threat, as does his shadow Minister for Defense, Andrew Hastie, and his party leader. Unfortunately, they are all primarily advised by one think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, which is an Australian government-funded think tank, but receives significant other funding from the US State Department, as well as many suppliers of arms. The role of ASPI is to advise the government of the best forward strategy. As with Eisenhower's warning of the military-industrial complex, it is not in the financial interests of ASPI, its donors, or its sponsors to exist in or advise of a peaceful world. But there's an even more insidious side to this US influence. How many people, for example, have heard the name James Clapper, or Admiral John Richardson, or Vice Admiral William Hilarides? The list goes on. There are, or were, 6 retired US admirals, 3 former civilian US Navy leaders, and 3 US military shipbuilding executives working in Canberra's Defense Department. And James Clapper, a former US intelligence officer, has helped the Australians to set up an Office of National Intelligence. Another former admiral, Kirkland Donald, was forced to resign from a part-time job in Australia advising the Royal Australian Navy on submarine purchases because it was discovered he was part of the military-industrial complex. He's the chairman of the board of the company building the very submarines he was advising Australia to buy. Given this information, which was discovered by the Washington Post, it's hardly a surprise that Australia decided to ditch an ongoing French contract for submarines to sign one with the USA. If Washington perceives a threat from China, that threat is perceived in Canberra too, where Washington seems to have opened a sub-office in the Pentagon, of the Pentagon, or at very least, a retired senior service club, every one of whom is a member of the military-industrial complex. It really is that deep. Given that the US government, US arms manufacturers, and US media are spending so much of their time, money, and influence in Australia selling the threat of China, it's worth looking at the threats more closely. Where does the media get its stories? Where does the Department of Defense get its intelligence assessments? Where do the think tanks get their information to advise the Department of Defense? And why do the media amplify every story they put out? And the answer is, it all boils down to a small but powerful and rich lobby group that permeates through every aspect of the decision-making processes. Imagine if the US government and US arm manufacturers were not paying ASPI to advise the Australian government. Imagine if the Offices of National Security was not created by an American. Imagine if the Australian naval decision makers had no retired American admirals working for arms manufacturers and advising them. Would there be a threat from China? The answer is no. There's only a threat because all these people are paid big money to keep it alive. Just for a moment, imagine if the stories of the threat from China weren't actually true. What would happen is that much of the world would trade with China. But outside of the Anglosphere, and even inside the Anglosphere, that's actually happening already. Much of the world would visit China and invite China to visit them. And that's already happening too. US financiers would visit China and seek help redressing their balance of their debt problems. And that's happening regularly too. Where's the threat? Much of the world's media would be writing more positively on China. And if you take a look at African, South American, Central American, and much of Asia's media, they are all reporting positively about China. Now, this may come as a surprise to anyone who's spent their time absorbing Anglosphere media. There is an entirely different world out there, where the US narrative is not followed. Why, for example, have more than 150 countries signed up to be part of the still expanding Belt and Road Initiative? Why are more than 40 countries interested in joining BRICS? Why have 10 more countries sought to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? In fact, if you take a look around the world and you read non-Anglosphere media, there is a very different story. We have been misled into believing the lies because the lies are repeated so often. The truth is very different, and if known inside the Anglosphere, it must generate changes. Changes that should mean the end of the military-industrial complex, and that would mean the end of US dominance. So what are the threats to China? There are 4 of them, but none of them are real. I'll explain how I know they're not real as we get to each of them. The next part of this series will look at the least threatening but most vocal of them all, the allegations of human rights abuses. So that will be the next part. But what are the threats? There are 4 major threats from China. All are perceived rather than real. All are amplified from misunderstandings and misinterpretations, and all can be explained in a different way. No one appears to have given any person in government or diplomatic circles or the political arena a sense of balance. We've never considered the other side of the debate, the one that says they might be wrong. Instead, we accept the threats. They must be real, but they're not. I've never yet seen a single person with my point of view interviewed on Western media to provide that balance. And I know from my Twitter and YouTube presence that there are many people, such as me, holding the same opinions. Why are they and I ignored? When viewed through a different lens, the threats become more benign. When viewed with a different cultural appreciation, the threats become less intimidating. And when viewed with correct interpretation, the threats diminish entirely. Unfortunately, when amplified by Anglosphere media, which they usually are, the threats appear increasingly more aggressive and intimidating. The 4 major threats the Western world perceives from China are human rights abuses in Xinjiang, the removal of democratic rights in Hong Kong, an aggressive military build-up, and an imminent invasion of Taiwan. And there's an alternative for all of them. Let's take a closer look at the first, human rights abuses, in the next episode. See you then. Bye for now.